Well, welcome back, and this is segment 2 of video 7 on effective practice strategies for the more advancing student or advanced pianist. In this section, we're going to talk about a number of other ideas of ways you can approach different difficult passages and just work through them to get the knots out, get things the way they should be so that you can learn quicker and more efficiently. The first one we're going to talk about in this segment is chord building or chord prep. They're two separate things, actually. And we're going to use the Debussy Le Petit Nègre, the opening of it. You're familiar with this. It's all chromatic in the left hand. Right? Okay, so this part is where everybody gets hung. So we're going to talk about the left hand for a moment, and if this was the first lesson, I would be addressing that right away. Because if you don't address it, they're going to be spending all their time trying to read the notes. There's a couple of things they need to know first. That we're doing chromatic, which means everything is up by half steps and down by half steps. The second thing they need to know is that they need to be snug on the white keys, right up against the blacks. Otherwise, they're doing this, and they're going to be making mistakes and be frustrated. You stay inside the lane. Now, how are we going to learn that other than those two things that I just said? Chord building is a lot what we talked about earlier about the forward note crawl. Now you're going to chord build going forward, and there's a number of ways you can do it. You could go, then 2 times is good. Don't land on the third or final one because that's not what you're going to do. Let it go. That's chord building, or forward chord crawl, if you will. It's not really a chord, they're thirds, but it's the same principle. Now, what about chord prep? Now, there's some, this is a practice strategy that you can do that will work to get you going. It's not something, it's just helping you. But if you shadow practice that left hand, when you get to the right hand, here we go. I'm going to slow it down. I'm going to shadow practice the left hand. Okay? It offers a chance to know if you really have it right or not, because now your ear has to pick up the sound instead of listening. Okay? And that it really focuses you on that left hand because you're shadowing it. Now, if you're feeling particularly creative, why don't you flip it upside down? That was a little more difficult because I had to keep being careful I was light enough in my hand. It's just a way of making your ear wake up and go, oh, I don't have the sound to go by. So chord prep can be very important. There's a number of ways you can do that. You could have done it in Eric's pieces. There were places where the chords could have been shadow practiced. It is just a really wonderful tool. Another thing about the shadow practice that's interesting is it makes you build on your ear, and if you want to practice something shadowed by memory, that really makes you think about whether you've got it or not, because you're not getting the sound to carry you. So the first thing is chord building. We can do that there. Now let's talk about chord building or shadow practice on the Waltz in A minor of Chopin, Opus Posthumous. Now, there's a number of ways to practice this, but one of the things you can do is shadow practice one or the other items. Let's pretend that you've already worked through the right hand. Now, the way I teach this is 3 levels. The first week, they do only the bottom note, so they're not doing the jump bass yet. Then the next week, I make them leave out the bottom, still not doing the jump bass. Okay? Now, one of the reasons is because once they get to this chord, they stop the piece to figure it out. So this is giving them a chance to not have to jump up and go from G to this. They're getting that worked out before they have to jump. Now, step 3, maybe third week, you're going to play the bottom note but shadow practice the chord. All right, now we're going to do the bottom note and let the shadow practice happen on beats 2 and 3. Now, if you want to be adventurous, you can do it the other way, but it's even a little more difficult. That's harder because I don't have the downbeat. Then put it together. So by the use of chord prep, you can do chord prep up to here, chord prep up to here, and not play, and shadow practice. I've had a lot of success. I tend to teach this as one of the first Chopin pieces. I teach an intermediate student. This one and one or two others I alternate. I do it this way, and we save all that agony of doing this. And then down here, and then back up here. You've got your melody, it's smooth, and the left hand folds in gradually using shadow practice, alternating the chords with the downbeat. The last thing you do is the jump bass, but you've already prepped it, you've already shadow practiced it, and then when you go to play it, it works ever so much better. So that's something that the shadow practice I don't use as much as I should, but it's a great tool. It's a great tool. Now, moving back to Opus 36, number 6 of Chopin, of Clementi. You might remember that at the beginning of the segment 1, we talked about that as the 4 level, as the magic 4, and talking about different ways that we could use the magic 4, from double notes to the different rhythms to the accents. Now, one way to then begin to pull it together is what we call 4-level tempo practice. Now, 4-level tempo practice you can also incorporate with your metronome, which I have on my phone, but let's talk about 4-level tempo practice first. 4-level tempo practice is taking a passage that's maybe 4 measures long. It's not something you do for a big, huge section, but this one's busy. And the first thing you do is you practice it almost note by note, which the best way to do this is staccato in the right. You have to be extremely disciplined, so therefore 2 measures or 4 measures are just plenty, okay? So we're gonna do 3 measures only because the ending is. So we're gonna leave that out and just do the 16th notes and do these 3 measures. So the first thing we're going to do is slow practice note by note, and you're better off staccato noting it so you don't end up pushing the notes and getting a note by note. You're gonna do, it's a note by note, but it's staccato, and I'm going horizontally. Still getting my directional in there, like that. That's about the tempo, and it is a note by note feeling. Now we go to half tempo. Half tempo, you have to really discipline yourself or you go too fast. The second thing is if you make the section too long, you're going to start speeding up, and we don't want that. So now I'm going to go back to legato, but I'm going to make sure I'm smooth and going across the keys, but I'm going to slow it down so I'm just to where the notes hang together. Always musical, always in direction. Now 3/4 tempo is just underneath the tempo. And then finally tempo. There you are, 4 tempos. Now the trick is that the first tempo has to be slow enough. Now if you want to, you could discipline yourself by putting the metronome to it. I would advise you do it with the flash and no sound, because the minute you start working with the metronome, overworking with the metronome, you start adding in a bunch of accents with each tick, and we don't want that. And you start thinking tick, 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 instead of the flow of the line. And that's why I think you have to be careful with the metronome. It can be a wonderful tool, but you have to be careful how you use it and use it judiciously. I know there was a time in my life where I metronomed everything up, and I'm going to talk about that next, but it was like the start and the be-all and end-all was to metronome something to death. And I think that there's a lot of negative that goes with that. It should be used as a tool and used sparingly, or judiciously, I should say. Now let's talk about the metronome march. I've got my metronome on my phone, which most of you probably also have. I've now lost it. Let me find it. Here we go. All right, now let me turn up my sound. Now, in talking about the metronome march, there is a way, let's say this passage is giving me trouble. I'm talking about working in small units of something that's just difficult. And let's just say these 3 measures are difficult. You can do a gradual increase over a number of days with the metronome march. So I'm going to say I'm starting at 50 to the quarter, okay? Now this goes with these digitals, you could go 1 tick by 1, but I think you're better off going by 2s because otherwise it takes you forever to get out of the slow. So I would do 3, you could do 3 or 4 a day. Right? This is my start. Okay, I take that much, I go up by 2, I'm now at 52. So now I'm at 52. And finally 54. Now this is where you need to keep some sort of practice notation in a book or online or something. I went from 50 to 54. Tomorrow I drop 50 and I start at 52 and I do 52, 54, 56. The next day I do 54, 56, 58. And what you're doing is ever so gradually picking up the tempo. I like to reserve this for just those really thorny passages. I may have already done the forward note crawl. I may have done Magic 9. I may have done any number of things. Usually I use it when I'm in a situation where there's stamina involved and I'm in one of those passages that just goes on for a page. And it's going to be, I could tighten up if I'm not careful. I work my way up a few times this way over a period of, a little bit here and there, to kind of make sure I've covered all my bases tempo-wise. And I think that's very important for you to consider. I don't use it a lot, but I used to use it all the time. And since I've developed so many more practice techniques and so many more practice ways to do things, I find the metronome march has pretty much fallen down to the bottom. But I can't say that on a few tough spots working with a trio, and I had one of those long pages that just never quit with 16ths and 30 seconds and they just took off and never stopped, I did metronome it up. I metronomed it up for the security of knowing that I had done it however many times it took to get from 50 to 110 or whatever it was I was getting it to. So metronome march is worth at least noting. Now, so that's Clementi Opus 36, number 6. You have to have a student mature enough to be able to do that, and it can work well. But again, it's a 1-week thing, and then you move on to something else. Now let's talk a little bit about practicing in rhythmic circles, and we're going to now on your screen, you're going to see the Mendelssohn Opus 72, number 1, the Allegro non troppo. This comes from the Christmas pieces of Mendelssohn. Okay, now this is the perfect gesture piece. So working in rhythmic circles, a gesture is simply a motion. So what's my first gesture? This. If you don't, you're going to have the student going down for each. Down, down, down. You can't play the piece that way. And if they do succeed in picking it up in tempo, now it's pretty unmusical. So I take the first slur, follow the slurs, and I do it, but I do it in a rhythm so that my rhythmic circle, I'm in 3/4 time. 4, 1, 2, 3. Once I get in the circle, bum, 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 bum. All right, now I'm going to move to the next one. I keep the rhythm going and let one whole measure break, but in rhythm, and come back in. So I don't lose my momentum. It's a momentum thing. 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. 3, 1, 2, 3. Now the next one. That's a longer one. Once I get started, I just keep going in my circle. Now I can combine 2 by 2. That far. And you can pick it up here on the second one and go to the third. And finally, put together 3 gestures. That is very effective practice. You're doing it in tempo, but you're doing it in small units. And you can use this circular rhythmic idea with passage work, with anything. Just make sure that when you're at the end of the passage, you don't stop the rhythm and then start from nothing, because then you're constantly starting from 0. Once the rhythm gets going, you just let a measure go by, jump back in. Measure of rest, jump back in. Gives you a chance to alternate, fix up notes that aren't right, get that feeling in your hand in small gestures. And this is a wonderful piece, by the way, as a segue into doing more chord practice. It has thirds, fourths, and fifths together harmonically, the occasional octave. It's very good, and there's a number of practice techniques that we've used today that you can do this. But I wanted to show you how to, what I call practice in rhythmic circles, using gesture practice, which is important. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you today, I'm going to go back to the prelude in C minor and talk about FOIL. FOIL stands for first, outer, inner, and last. Now, for the most part, we have a chord in the right hand and an octave in the left, and we have filled in chords, so there are 4 notes in the right. Right? I'll just use this. 2 measures. That far is plenty. First means you're going to play the top note of each hand. So don't worry about the fingering so much. The top hand is going to be a 5, but sorry. Now, this really helps me with my melody, but I hear a little better the underpinning of it. Now, outer means you play, I would just keep it with the thumb on the left hand and play the top 2 notes for outer, the top 2 notes of each chord. So first, outer. Inner is where it's difficult. Inner, and you really don't always have your fingerings right, but you're hearing those inner notes. So, inner, took me a minute. So that's the alto and the tenor voice. First, outer, inner, last are your bottoms of each hand. Now, in the earlier video, I talked about first and last, which you can do with students that are doing like 3-note chords. We did the Kabalevsky Takatina, you know, and we did them in 6, open. Then filled in. Or you could even do the bottom 2. However, trying to teach students to read and comprehend and play inner notes on a 4-note grouping is a much more advanced technique, and I wouldn't be doing it before early advanced. And it has to be something like this, where you can then put it together. Remember, we talked earlier in this segment about how this first line drives people crazy and it can take them months to learn it. So I'm just giving you, FOIL is something that you're not going to use a lot, but it's helpful in something like this. And again, Fatigue takes over. If you're going to do this, you need to make sure that you practice in small units and just a little bit, as something you did along with the forward chord crawl or downbeat to downbeat. We talked about that in this piece. So already we've talked about forward note crawl, we've talked about backup practice, and now I'm talking about foil. So you can take any part of this piece and do different things with it every day. And that's just 3 of the things I came up with to talk about today. So far in this video, we've talked about breaking down that magic 9 that was taught in the first video to magic 4 with the accents, which are a more advanced way of practicing. We did the forward note crawl, which can also be a forward chord crawl or forward thirds crawl. We did backup practice, chord building, chord prep, shadow practice, 4-level tempo practice, metronome march, practicing in rhythmic circles, and finally foil. So I've given you probably between the 2 videos 15, 16 different ways to practice passage work, approach a piece. Of course, it's all predicated on breaking down those sections from the very beginning. So I hope this has been useful to you. In future videos, we're going to be talking about practicing a fugue and how to do that, or practicing an invention, certain genres, and some things that are special to those genres, but that's for another day. So now that I've given you the summary of the things that we learned today, I'd like to put this together with a student, Eric, who is rising grade 8, the end of middle school here in Cary. He's going to join us in just a minute for a student demo. And we're going to go through some of these ways in which he uses it in his music. One piece is already learned, the other piece is brand new, being introduced today. And we're going to talk about some of the ways we use the very things we discussed today in the video will be incorporated into his lesson. So join me in a minute for Eric's demo.